Hi, welcome back to Engine Shop Joe. Today we're going to take a look at a particular engine part. In the next few videos I'm going to look at different parts on the engine that people might, if they open the hood and look at it, you'll see the part. I'm going to talk a little bit about the part, what it does, maybe why it does it, maybe how it does it. It depends on the part. So let's get going. Today we're going to look at the exhaust gas pressure sensor, how it gets the pressure, and some particulars about it that you need to know so that you realize how important this sensor is on your Cummins engine that has EGR. And engines that do not have an EGR cooler will not have this sensor. This sensor was put on the very first EGR engine, and that's when they started with VGT. And originally VGT was developed so that they could control the flow of exhaust gas through the EGR cooler and then control the mixture of exhaust gas and fresh air in the turbocharger. And the very first heavy-duty engine that had that was the ISX CM870. And if you remember, the 870 had a big air cylinder on the turbo with a lever that could move the VGT up or down, and then it had a turbo control valve, they called it. The early ones were on top of the engine by the valve cover on the front right, where the exhaust gas pressure sensor is today. And then the later generations of that same engine, they moved it underneath the air compressor, and it was a box that was approximately 6 inches long, 4 inches high, maybe 5 inches deep, and it had a harness going to it and air from the air compressor, and then it had an air line from it over to the turbo. And then on the 871 they made all that electronic, got rid of the air controls because they were just primitive when it came to trying to control splitting hairs with EGR flow by using exhaust gas pressure to assist in that. So let's take a look at the exhaust gas pressure sensor that made its debut on the ISX back in about 2005 when they came out with the ISX CM870. And we still have that sensor today, by the way, on the X15 2450s. So the exhaust gas pressure sensor receives the pressure signal out of the exhaust manifold through a steel line. That line has an inverted flare fitting on each end, kind of like you'd see on your brake line on your car. And if you can't find the exhaust gas pressure sensor, just find this line where it's screwed in the manifold and then follow the line up. It will either go right into the bottom of a fitting that the sensor screws in the top of, or into a housing, and then the sensor will be directly above the line where it goes in the housing. I say that because on the ISX, which we'll see in a little bit, that housing is the back of the thermostat housing, and it's just a solid piece of cast iron there with a hole drilled up through it, and the line carrying exhaust gas pressure goes in at about a 30-degree angle off the bottom of the housing, and then up through the housing, up that hole, and the sensor screws in the top of the housing. Okay, let's take a look at where the sensor is on this QSL. So here we are up in the front of the engine. The picture's a little distorted. Sorry about that. That's from resizing. So you can see the line goes up right to where my finger is, and there's a bracket that's bolted on the engine, and the sensor screws down in the bracket, and the line goes right up in the bottom. So that's part of the reason that this line is longer, because you want to get some of the heat out of there before you blast that sensor with it. And the sensor will always be away from the exhaust manifold itself so that it doesn't get cooked, because there is a 3-wire harness that plugs into that sensor. This is an ISX CM2350, and I've got a yellow line following that red short tube that comes out of the front section of the ISX manifold. Pretty much all of them do if it's an automotive. It curves back, curves forward again, and then goes up at an angle into the back of the thermostat housing there. And then you can see the yellow line going vertically at the top, and that's to demonstrate the passage inside that housing. And there's the exhaust gas pressure sensor on top with the pigtail plugged into it, and that's a 3-wire pigtail. In this photo, I've got a circle around the fitting that's screwing into the exhaust manifold, and I think that's a 1/2 inch. We use a 1/2 inch flare nut wrench to get that out. I'm pretty sure that's the size of it. It's not metric, not at this point in time anyway. And that line's hollow, of course, that steel line. And they do plug up with carbon. So whenever you take that sensor out of the top, in this case, blow through that line, blow through the hole the sensor bolts in with shop air. You won't hurt anything. It's going in the exhaust manifold. And make sure you can blow through it. You can hear it. You can hear the noise, the air moving. Because I have seen the ports plug up inside the exhaust manifold where they drill the hole. I've seen them plug solid with carbon. And you can pull that line off, blow through the line, it's open, blow through the housing, it's open. But you can't take a scribe and stick it into the exhaust manifold. It's closed shut. And then you'll get faults on the exhaust gas pressure sensor for it being the pressure way too low. It also will lock your EGR out. It'll also cause after treatment functions to be locked out. So this is a very powerful sensor. And here in our last photo, you see the exhaust gas pressure sensor. And the pigtail's got a boot that goes over the sensor. This is all painted. You can see it's got the tab to release the sensor. It's got the red fail-safe in it that you have to slide sideways. Then you can squeeze the tab and pull the sensor off. It's a 3-wire sensor. 1 wire is ground. 1 wire is a 5-volt from the ECM that feeds it. And then the other wire is the signal return. That's between about 0.69 key on engine off up to probably a little over 4 volts when the system's running. The exhaust gas pressure will read the same as the ambient air pressure sensor when it's key on engine off, because it's measuring pressure in the manifold, and that should be the same as ambient air pressure key on engine off. So if you look at your barometric pressure sensor, whatever that's reading in inches of mercury, your exhaust gas pressure sensor should read very close to that. Typically where I am at, you'll see about 28.8 or 29.1 inches of mercury on a barometric pressure sensor, and the exhaust gas pressure should be the same. But I've seen it, and typically it's a little bit higher. It's 30 inches of mercury to 31. If you start seeing 32, then it might be time to change that sensor, because they do take a real beating all day long from that pulsing exhaust and the heat. So the sensors can fall out of range, lose their calibration value, if you will. And they can cause real problems if they get out of range enough, and then they are sending bad data up into higher pressure ranges, because the ECM will adjust the turbo according to that. It'll decide if the engine's firing okay according to what that sensor's telling it. So the sensor does a lot of functions. Problems, typically if you have faults where you see where the sensor is not sending any signal, which would be voltage low, signal voltage low. I've seen the harness wires break where they bend, inside the harness, of course. I've seen the pigtails. If you check pin drag, when you unplug that sensor, the pin drag, it'll be loose on one of the terminals. So we've repaired problems with signal voltage being low with new pigtails, and you can buy a pigtail from Cummins that's pre-made for this. You just solder the wires on. I suggest you solder it because it's a sensitive low voltage circuit. It comes with butt connectors on it. You can crimp that and heat shrink it. I like to solder. You don't have to. I suggest you do, but if you do a good job of crimping, as you should, and heat shrink that to keep moisture out, you should be okay. The sensors themselves just screw in. They've got an O-ring on them. I've never had a problem with a sensor coming out. If that sensor starts to leak up by that O-ring, say the O-ring gets hard and cracks and it starts to leak, the exhaust gas pressure will plug that entire tube, the exhaust gas pressure sensing tube, and you'll have to replace the tube and then drill the hole out in the manifold. Just pop that plug out where I told you it'll plug up earlier, and then you'll be all set to go again. So every engine with EGR has one of these sensors, and now you know about as much about it as I do. Thanks for joining me on Engine Shop Joe. We'll see you next time.